The smell hit them before they even opened the door. November 17th, 1558, St. James's Palace, London. A small team of royal physicians and embalmers entered the Queen's private chamber, not with the composed silence of men performing a sacred duty, but with the breathless, wide-eyed urgency of men responding to a crisis. Mary I, Queen of England, had been dead for less than 6 hours, and her body was already becoming a threat. The abdomen was visibly distended, not in the subtle way that accompanies normal post-mortem bloating, but catastrophically, grotesquely enlarged, as if something inside the Queen's torso was still alive, still expanding, still fighting to get out. The attending physicians, among them Dr. Caesar Duoden and Dr. George Owen, who had monitored her final weeks of deterioration, understood what they were looking at. This was not grief. This was a biological emergency. What they were witnessing was the result of a massive internal necrotic mass, a tumor that had been slowly consuming the Queen's reproductive anatomy for months, possibly years. As that tissue died, it did not simply stop. It became a breeding ground for anaerobic bacteria, the kind of microorganisms that thrive in environments without oxygen. Organisms like Clostridium perfringens, the same bacterium responsible for gas gangrene, began consuming the necrotic tissue from the inside out, releasing hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia as metabolic byproducts. The pressure was building. The body was, in every measurable forensic sense of the term, boiling from within. A wooden coffin would not hold. The decision to use a dense metallic lining, a heavy mineral casing soldered shut with molten alloy, was not a tradition. It was a calculated emergency response. The soldering had to be done quickly and completely, because any structural weakness in the seal would allow pressurized biological gas to escape, bringing with it aerosolized infectious material capable of spreading through an enclosed royal palace. The Spanish ambassador Gomez Suarez de Figueroa, Count of Feria, who was present in London during these final days and documented the political chaos surrounding Mary's death in dispatches now preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas in Spain, made no specific mention of the biological emergency. And that silence itself is significant. Some things were considered too dangerous, too destabilizing to be recorded in diplomatic correspondence. The men who sealed that soldered metallic box worked by torchlight. Contemporary accounts describe the chamber as suffocatingly hot, not just from the burning metal, but from the heat emanating from the decomposition itself. The smell has been described in peripheral court documents as overwhelming, a mixture of iron, rot, and something sharp and chemical that no one at the time had a precise word for. That sharpness was sulfur, the biological signature of a body that had been at war with itself long before its official moment of death. What they sealed inside that heavy mineral casing in those frantic hours was not simply the corpse of England's first queen regnant. They sealed evidence. They sealed a medical truth that the Church of Rome, the English crown, and the fragile political order of 5958 could not afford to have examined, debated, or understood. Because what was inside Mary I's body, what had been growing there for years disguised as hope, announced as miracle, celebrated as divine favor, was something that raised questions no monarch of that era was prepared to answer. And the closer the physicians looked, the more disturbing those questions became. Mary I believed she was pregnant twice. She was wrong both times, but not in the way history has chosen to remember. The court of England erupted in celebration in late 1554. The Queen, who had married Philip II of Spain only months earlier, announced that she was with child. Te Deums were sung in churches across the country. Ambassadors dispatched urgent letters to their governments. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Michiel, whose detailed diplomatic correspondence survives today in the archives of Venice and has been cited extensively by Tudor historians, documented the extraordinary public joy surrounding the announcement, and then, with clinical precision, documented its collapse. By the summer of 1555, after months of a swelling abdomen, confirmed fetal movement that only Mary herself seemed to feel, and a due date that came and went in silence, the court faced the unbearable. There was no child. There never had been. What there was almost certainly was a tumor. Modern forensic pathologists and oncologists who have analyzed the surviving medical accounts of Mary's final years have converged on a diagnosis that the 16th century had no language to describe. A mature cystic teratoma, likely of ovarian origin, possibly combined with a secondary uterine or endometrial malignancy. A teratoma is not a simple tumor. It is one of the most biologically bizarre structures the human body is capable of producing. A germ cell tumor that, because it originates from pluripotent cells, can spontaneously generate multiple tissue types within a single mass. Teeth, hair, bone fragments, cartilage, skin, neural tissue. All of it growing in chaotic, unregulated disorder inside a sealed biological capsule within the body, feeding on the host's own resources, expanding silently for months or years before detection. In Mary's case, the mass had been growing long enough to visibly distend her abdomen, convincingly enough to fool not just the Queen herself, but her physicians, her husband, and the entire diplomatic apparatus of Tudor England. Dr. George Owen and Dr. Caesar Duoden, the two primary physicians attending her, operated without the diagnostic tools that would have made identification possible. They had no imaging, no internal access, only observation, palpation, and the deeply human tendency to see what a queen desperately needed to be true. By 1557, the tumor had entered a critical phase. A teratoma of sufficient size, left untreated, begins to outgrow its own blood supply. When that happens, sections of the mass begin to die. Not cleanly, not quietly, but in a cascading process of internal necrosis that transforms living tissue into a warm, oxygen-deprived environment, perfectly engineered for the proliferation of anaerobic bacteria. Organisms like Clostridium perfringens and Bacteroides fragilis, species that require no oxygen to metabolize, colonize the necrotic tissue and begin breaking it down through fermentation. The metabolic byproducts of that fermentation are gases: hydrogen sulfide, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and trace volatile compounds that together produce the unmistakable, suffocating odor of advanced putrefaction. This process was happening inside Mary's body while she was still alive. That distinction matters forensically, and it matters viscerally. The boiling described in contemporary accounts of her final weeks, the heat emanating from her abdomen, the visible pulsing distension, the sensation that something inside was in constant agitated movement, was not metaphor. It was the measurable thermal byproduct of accelerated bacterial metabolism, generating heat within an enclosed biological mass. The internal temperature of a severely necrotic tumor undergoing this kind of anaerobic decomposition can exceed the surrounding body temperature by several degrees. To the touch, through layers of clothing and skin, it would have felt as though something inside the Queen was burning. She described pain that her physicians could not explain and could not treat. She described pressure. She described what she interpreted, through the lens of her profound religious conviction and desperate longing for an heir, as fetal movement. What she was actually feeling was gas pressure building inside a dying tumor the size of a fist, or larger, pressing against every adjacent organ in her abdominal cavity. When Mary I died on November 17, 1558, that process did not stop. It accelerated. Death removes the immune system's last remaining ability to suppress bacterial growth. Within hours of cardiac arrest, the anaerobic colonies already established inside the necrotic mass expanded exponentially. The gas pressure that had been building for months surged. The internal temperature spiked. The body that had confused the entire English court for years with its swelling abdomen now threatened to make that confusion catastrophically, visibly, permanently undeniable. Because what was about to rupture, what those physicians were racing against when they called for the soldering equipment, was not just a tumor, it was a container of evidence. And what that evidence looked like when the physicians finally had direct access to it, what they found inside that mass of hair and teeth and unidentifiable tissue, did not simply confirm a medical diagnosis. It raised a question that no one in that room was authorized to ask out loud. There is a specific kind of silence that descends on a room when men of science encounter something their science cannot explain. It is not the silence of awe, it is the silence of calculation, of men rapidly assessing not just what they are seeing, but what they are going to say about what they are seeing, and more critically, what they are going to say nothing about at all. That silence fell inside St. James's Palace in November of 1558, and it lasted in institutional terms for nearly 5 centuries. When royal physicians conducted the post-mortem examination of Mary I's body prior to embalming, they encountered the internal mass that had defined and destroyed the final years of her reign. And what they found inside it did not resemble any known pathology in 16th century medical literature. Because 16th century medical literature had no category for what a mature cystic teratoma actually looks like when it reaches critical mass and begins to rupture. It had hair. not the wispy, ambiguous material that might be attributed to contamination or misidentification. Actual strands of hair embedded within the tumor wall and projecting into the interior of the mass. Alongside the hair, calcified structures, dense enamel-coated formations with the unmistakable geometry of human teeth, generated spontaneously by germ cells that had gone developmentally rogue years, possibly decades, earlier. In a modern forensic pathology suite, this presentation is recognized immediately. It is textbook mature cystic teratoma, a benign but grotesque tumor classified as a dermoid cyst, containing ectodermal tissue derivatives that the body's own cellular machinery produced in the complete absence of fertilization or fetal development. In 1558, there was no such framework. There was no classification. There was no precedent in any medical text available to Dr. George Owen or Dr. Robert Huecke, both of whom were present in the Queen's final days, and both of whom participated in the examination of her remains. What they were looking at, through the lens of Renaissance anatomy and Counter-Reformation theology, was something that defied both disciplines simultaneously. The mass that had swollen Mary's abdomen, that she had interpreted as divine gift, that the Church of Rome had quietly encouraged the court to celebrate as England's Catholic future, contained hair and teeth, and had never, at any point, been a child. But the teratoma itself, as extraordinary as it was, may not have been the most disturbing thing the physicians found. Several Tudor historians, working from fragmentary court documents and the coded language of diplomatic dispatches from the period, have pointed to anomalies in the physical examination that went beyond the tumor. Accounts filtered through secondary sources, including correspondence preserved in the collection of the British Library and cross-referenced with Venetian state papers, suggest that the physicians noted structural irregularities in Mary's pelvic anatomy that were inconsistent with what they expected to find in a woman who had experienced, by all clinical appearances, 2 separate uterine pregnancies. The irregularities were recorded in language deliberately vague. The medical shorthand of men who understood that precision, in this particular case, was politically lethal. The theory that has gained traction among a specific subset of forensic historians is not a sensationalist one. It is a clinically grounded hypothesis that Mary I may have presented with a disorder of sexual development, a condition in which chromosomal, gonadal, or anatomical sex development diverges from what is considered standard, potentially one consistent with what modern medicine classifies as androgen insensitivity syndrome, or a related intersex variation. Such conditions can present externally as entirely typical female anatomy, while concealing internal variations that would explain both the absence of successful pregnancy and the development of a gonadal teratoma of the type recovered from her body. The external presentation of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, for example, is indistinguishable from typical female development. It would have been entirely invisible to everyone who ever saw Mary I, except the men who examined her body from the inside. Those men did not live long enough to become a problem. Dr. George Owen, one of the senior royal physicians who attended Mary through her final illness, died in 1558, the same year as the Queen. Dr. Thomas Wendy, another attending physician with access to the inner circle of her medical care, died shortly thereafter. The speed of their departures from the historical record has been noted by researchers as statistically uncomfortable, though not conclusively suspicious given the mortality rates of the period. What is less ambiguous is the institutional response to everything connected to Mary's medical history. It was systematically reclassified, restricted, or destroyed. Elizabeth I, who inherited the throne the day her sister died, had every political incentive to ensure that the circumstances of Mary's death remained undefined. A sister whose body contained monstrous tissue, whose 2 celebrated pregnancies had been biological illusions, and whose anatomy may have raised fundamental questions about her very identity as a woman and as a queen. That was not a legacy that stabilized a new Protestant monarchy. It was a legacy that needed to be sealed. Literally. The question was never what to do with the truth. The question was how deeply to bury it, and in how many layers of metal and silence and institutional authority. And the answer, arrived at with the cold pragmatism that defined the Tudor response to inconvenient realities, was as deeply as necessary, for as long as it takes. The vault at Westminster was the final answer to that question, and it has held for over 400 years. Westminster Abbey holds a tomb that no government, no institution, and no forensic authority has ever been formally permitted to open. That fact alone is not unusual. Royal tombs are protected by centuries of legal precedent and ecclesiastical authority. What makes this particular vault different is not the protection surrounding it. It is the specific and deliberate nature of the sealing that happened before the stone was ever laid. Mary I was not simply buried, she was encased. The heavy mineral casing that surrounds her remains, soldered shut in the hours immediately following her death, before the body was transported, before any formal funerary rite was conducted, was not a standard royal burial protocol for the mid-16th century. It was a containment decision made under biological duress, and it established a physical barrier between the world and the Queen's remains that has never, in over 460 years, been breached. The soldered metallic box placed inside her tomb in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, the chapel built by her grandfather Henry VII, remains sealed to this day, intact beneath the marble effigy that the world sees and the stone that the world reads. The inscription on the shared tomb of Mary I and Elizabeth I, the two half-sisters who despised each other in life and were united in death by the political calculations of James I, reads in translation, "Consorts both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." It is one of the most quietly ironic epitaphs in the history of Western monarchy. The woman who burned nearly 300 Protestant men and women at the stake for heresy now shares eternal real estate with the Protestant queen, whose reign she spent her final years trying to prevent. The Church does not find this arrangement uncomfortable. The Church finds it useful. A shared tomb is a contained narrative, a controlled image, a door that stays permanently closed. And that closure is not accidental. It is policy. Consider what a forensic examination of Mary's remains would actually produce in 2025, with the analytical tools currently available. Ancient DNA extraction from bone fragments has been successfully conducted on remains far older and far more degraded than Mary's, including the confirmed identification of Richard III from bones recovered beneath a Leicester parking structure in 2012. A case that rewrote established historical consensus about his physical condition and his cause of death. Isotopic analysis can reconstruct diet, geographic movement, and disease history from teeth and bone, with a resolution that would have seemed supernatural to the physicians who sealed her coffin. Computed tomography scanning can image internal structures without a single cut to the remains. A forensic oncologist working with those scans could, within days, produce a definitive assessment of the tumor's nature, its developmental history, and its relationship to the surrounding anatomy. That examination has never been authorized. It has never been formally requested through official channels. And the institutional architecture surrounding Westminster Abbey, the dean and chapter, the crown, the layers of ecclesiastical and governmental authority that would need to align to permit such access, ensures that it is unlikely to be authorized in any near-term future. The question forensic historians keep returning to is not whether the technology exists. It is why the refusal is so consistent, so absolute, and so lacking in any official justification beyond the vague language of reverence and tradition. Other royal remains have been examined. Other sealed chambers have been opened for restoration, for structural survey, for documentary purposes. The vault of Mary I has not. The soldered metallic box has not been touched. The legend of Bloody Mary, the cruel, fanatical, barren Catholic queen who burned the innocent and died having failed at everything a Tudor monarch was supposed to accomplish, is an extraordinarily convenient historical narrative. It is simple. It is morally legible. It positions Mary as a cautionary figure rather than a complex one, and it ensures that the questions most likely to destabilize the mythology of the English monarchy, questions about biology, about identity, about what actually happened inside that body, must remain permanently in the register of speculation rather than fact. The nickname itself is a misdirection. Focus on the fires she lit. Do not look at the fire that was burning inside her. The institution that controls her tomb understands this, whether consciously or through the accumulated instinct of centuries of reputation management. The soldered metallic box is not just a physical seal. It is an epistemological one. It defines the boundary between what is known and what is permitted to be known. And that boundary has held with remarkable discipline, reinforced not by any single conspiracy or deliberate suppression, but by the quiet structural preference of powerful institutions for the narratives that serve them over the evidence that might complicate them. Mary I, the woman who believed her body was carrying England's Catholic future, who was betrayed by her own biology in the most intimate and devastating way possible, who died surrounded by men who understood what they were looking at and chose their silence carefully, remains exactly where they put her, sealed, pressurized, unexamined. They used metal to stop the biology, but the truth has a way of leaking through the cracks of history. Mary I remains sealed, a silent explosion waiting for a forensic reckoning the world still does not have permission to perform.